So today we're going to focus on how to secure the supply chain, but with a focus on procurement. So as I mentioned in the kickoff, Labs is all about the partners, and this project is a perfect example of that. The concept, much of the expertise, and all of the data come from various partners. So let me introduce that partner team. First up, we have Jay Town. He's the former U.S. Attorney from the Northern District of Alabama, also formerly a judge advocate in the Marine Corps. As a result, he is very well versed in what we're trying to accomplish. Jay, thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Next, we have Steve Brusino. He's the VP of Advanced Technology at Gray Analytics. He's worked on the government and the contractor side, and he's really been focused on the procurement integration of multiple ACAT-1 programs, and he's got the scars to prove that. So, Stephen, greatly appreciate you being here as well.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we have Farley Mesko. He's the CEO of Sayari Labs. It's an intelligent platform that provides data about how organizations and people are connected. He also has an extensive background in financial crime analysis. And really, his data is something else. So, Farley, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Cal.
So, Jay, you were a U.S. attorney. Let's start off with you. From that vantage point, can you give us some perspective on how the supply chain impacts us here?
Sure. So one of in the recent administrations, we've noticed that Iran, Russia, and certainly China have really impacted not just our cyber environments, but our supply chain environments as well. We have to give ourselves permission to admit that having a hygienic cyber environment is a great concept, great start. CMMC certainly provides that, but it's certainly a half measure if we do not secure our supply chains, which is sort of the new frontier of intrusion into American ingenuity, certainly as it relates to our defense industrial base. China has posed, I think FBI Director Chris Wray and some others, DHS Secretary Pompeo, have all assessed that China poses the long-term threat to the United States, the greatest long-term threat to the United States right now currently, and that is based on, in part, the assessment that they are trying to intrude and have been successful in intruding upon our supply chains in the United States in all 10 economic sectors.
You make a good point about the 10 economic sectors. I mean, I somewhat naively look at supply chain really as being a DoD and security focused thing, but I think as COVID has made clear to all of us, it's much larger than that. And can you expand on that point a little bit?
Sure. Any business owner or family member who has tried to secure PPE in the last 6 months understands that when you have a single source nation for whether it was protective gowns, protective masks, rubber gloves even, you could not secure it in this country for the prices at least that they were in February of 2020. And so I think what that highlights, and you scale that in all of the economic sectors, so big pharma being one where we're getting these precursors from nations like China and other Asian nation states, but the defense industrial base, these rare earth materials that we need for our wafer boards, for our super micros, or any of the components that find their way into our armaments, it certainly is important that we understand that if it comes from one place, that any of our policies that impact that one place could impact the entire supply chain. And so commercial organizations in the defense industrial base all need to understand where they are sourcing their materials so that they can be sure to source it in case there is some sort of an event.
Stephen, the project we've been building together addresses some of or a lot of the issues that Jay is talking about. Can you give a little background on the thought process behind ChainShield and how that came online?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's kind of interesting, as we think back to the things that Jay just kind of highlighted, we're really trying with this effort to democratize, the knowledge, the skills, the abilities that are associated with, how you conduct supply chain assessments. If you think about some of the things that we've seen in the past relative to the threat space, they're very singular focused. And so we want to make sure that we have an impact on the supply chain at all phases of the procurement process. And we call this supply chain illumination. So from a DoD acquisition perspective, program managers typically try to conduct various assessments as it relates to those milestone decisions and also at major reviews. And one of the things that we've seen is that over the years, this data typically resides at the secret and top secret levels. And so commercial companies have no access to, that sort of information. And so they're certainly at a disadvantage. And the really good data, it's so sparse. You sometimes run into a situation where an analyst is left to infer so much about, what's the real risk of this particular issue? Can I get the kind of data that is of sufficient fidelity to be able to render to my PM a true, risk assessment? And obviously that's problematic. So, we're really excited about this. And you typically see, two main efforts today to try to address this problem, at least in DoD acquisitions. You see that there are supply chain assessments where you take, analytical approaches and methodologies, and you do research into those piece parts, the vendors, the design specifications, et cetera, to determine the risk. And then, as we indicated, there's obviously knowledge gaps associated with this, and that really good data, like we said, is very hard to get your hands on. There's also very limited tools. So there's no standard set of tools that you can go leverage to conduct this sort of assessment. So if you had someone come to you, and say, hey, I'd really like to get this done, they're at a disadvantage already because there's no standard within DoD. So the national labs obviously have observed this, and that's kind of their role, is to help the federal government with these kind of late-breaking, cutting-edge kind of problems, kind of standardize some thinking around problem spaces. And so they've developed solutions to help frame this through analytics and other frameworks, and hope to dissect in the problem into piece parts to help manage it, as a whole. In fact, Motor Corporation, right down the road here, in McLean, they did such a thing in their development of the crown jewels analysis and the threat assessment remediation analysis research that has sometimes been used to support SCRIM assessments. The other thing that you typically see within DoD acquisitions is if you have some insight that you may have been compromised, the supply chain's been compromised, it's typically very focused on a piece part. So you'll have a piece of hardware that has been procured, it made it through the PDR CDR process, and so now you're starting to actually mock up and build a capability. And there may have been something that tipped off a logistician or some of the folks, maybe even in the mailroom, as benign as that may sound. And so you can send off those hardware piece parts to national labs where they actually do some really detailed kind of hardcore assessments on, hey, is this exactly what we were hoping to procure or not? And obviously that's of tremendous value to a PM and to an organization, a DoD agency. But lots of times the data that you get back is it's very minimal, and it's typically kind of borders more on the, hey, you really are to consider another option in your design as opposed to going with this one. So not a lot of flow of real data, to help the PMs or the analysts make a decision, and there's never really an alternative provided, just maybe some inference that this one is not the one you want to go with.
Gotcha. So if that's kind of the way things are currently done, what did the team come up with to improve that process?
Yeah, so we're really excited. So Gray Analytics and obviously SAP, National Security Service, we teamed up to create the solution that we call ChainShield. And it's such an exciting endeavor because it really gets after some of those problems that we just highlighted, whether, as we're trying to democratize this information, and it helps an organization illuminate the overall supply chain. And we do this through a couple different things, a couple different ways, and obviously data science is at the core of this. We ingest vast amounts of open source data that in times past would have been of very little value to the kinds of scenarios I just laid out a few minutes ago. And we stitch kind of every usable nugget together in hopes of identifying those anomalies or issues so that we can then report them back to the end user. Our data sets are both ubiquitous, meaning that they're all around us. And then we have data that's in and of itself, of very little value, in times past. And so, we take highly refined data and data that is very raw and unstructured, and we piece all of that together to make some really cool inferences about things that may be going on within your supply chain. Farley is going to speak to one of those data sets that we have leveraged in this architecture. And so the primary function of ChainShield solution is to actively monitor those supply chains and aid those decision makers in the identification of possible threats and the overall evolving risk to their respective supply chains in real time. So both the government, commercial, procurement personnel, they could use a solution to source components that they need to fulfill any contract or any source selection. And through the unique ChainShield algorithms, if we determine that an item is of concern within the framework, our supply chain intelligence analyst or whoever may be monitoring that UI, they're not only aware of the compromised components, but we also provide them of other uncompromised alternate sources of components, products, and piece parts. And so when we think about securing the supply chain, we immediately think of hacking a supply chain. That's how the threat has kind of been postulated in times past. And what we're really saying here is that we're looking at the threat from a whole different perspective. We're trying to tackle the problem from a whole different perspective. And in this visualization, you're able to see program managers, the supply chain managers, item managers, procurement analysts, intelligence analysts, any government agency official or commercial company official immediately has visibility through that kind of single pane to be able to make determinations about what's going on within their respective supply chains. It's not singular focused. It's more holistic.
So Stephen, thank you for that rundown on ChainShield. When we get this fully online, what kind of questions will it be able to answer?
Yeah, so as I was just kind of laying out, there's obviously a lot of folks that are going to look at this data and it's going to be of value to them. But the kinds of things that it's going to help answer are things like, are we ethically sourcing, whatever that given end item is that we're looking for from places or countries where women's suffrage, is an issue. We don't want to be doing business in that area, or where child labor is common, or where armed conflict is a regular occurrence in townships or communities. The other kinds of things that we're looking at answering is, is this particular item a high-risk end item, or is that a high-risk vendor? Are there alternate end items? Are there alternate vendors that provide a similar product with similar capabilities? We're also identifying items or areas requiring increased vendor depth, so we can help determine where you need more depth to ensure that your particular supply chain remains very healthy. We're obviously illuminating the entire supply chain, so we're looking at everything from procurement all the way to final product delivery and sustainment of that product. We're looking at sourcing locations of concern, as we kind of mentioned, identifying suspicious shipments because there's a threat space there before final delivery, nefarious interests by designated nationals or block persons list, which is where SIARI comes in. We're really excited about what that data set provides. And then obviously many, many other things that we're trying to do with that. But you can tell that we're getting after the problem space or the threat space in a more holistic way from the way it's been done in the past.
One of the real strengths of ChainShield is the way we're combining different data sources to provide an overview of risks. And as Stephen has alluded to, one of those key partners is our partner, SIARI. So Farley, can you give us an overview of SIARI and the kind of data you provide?
Well, I think the best way to think about this is very rarely is your supply chain risk obvious, right? Most of the time, supply chain risk by its very nature is not limited to your direct customer or supplier. And you need to be able to answer questions like who owns this company, through however many layers of subsidiaries or ownership you might encounter. Who else does it do business with? Does it contract with foreign governments in China or in Russia? And so being able to answer those types of questions is critical to being able to understand or get your kind of arms around the problems that Stephen was laying out here. And so to be able to tackle a problem at scale, in a country like a China or a Russia, that requires comprehensive data on people and companies, right? And it requires comprehensive data not just on those companies, but on their relationships. So you need this massive amount of connected company information to really be able to untangle those types of problems. And that's what we provide.
The data has been super useful to us. The story behind SIARI and how you guys came online. Can you provide a few details there? That's an interesting piece as well, kind of your background.
Yeah, I think that the best way to think about it is over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been a massive push all over the world, even in some of those high-risk places that we've talked about, like Russia, like China, like Venezuela, toward the digitization of government services, of public services. And so moving all of that online, things like company creation, litigation filing, dispute filing, procurement, bidding, all of that leaves a digital paper trail. And again, 5-10 years ago, this wouldn't necessarily be possible. But within that digital paper trail are the answers to those questions that I laid out. Who owns this company? For whose benefit does it truly operate, right? Does it have contractual relationships via a procurement database or a procurement filing that would reveal that that company may produce or use military items, you know, and bring you afoul of, you know, Commerce Department regulations or Treasury regulations. And so again, that's the type of data that we provide. And I think that's the type of data that's critical to being able to answer these types of non-obvious supply chain risk questions.
So thanks, gents. We've got a few minutes left, so a few more questions for each of you. Farley, let's start with you. What you've talked about, it sounds like there's going to be a ton of data there. So how does that scale for you?
It's a good question. You know, if you think about how many companies and key people of those companies there are in the world, right? There's hundreds of millions. You know, even in just China alone, 60 million companies with hundreds of millions of relationships. Any one of those could be a vector back to the central government, the military, the PLA, one of their research institutes, or an entity that's on a sanctions or a commerce control list, right? And so when you're talking about data at that scale, comprehensive data at that scale, and connected data at that scale, and being able to or having to run, you know, the types of analytics or queries against that data that will get you the answers that you need to some of these supply chain risk questions. You know, the technology to be able to do that, to be able to build a graph of links and nodes at that scale and actually query it meaningfully, you know, that's really only in the last couple of years that we've been able to do that. So we're very fortunate that, you know, we're in an interesting moment, you know, technically speaking, in terms of our ability to actually do this and not have it be computationally prohibitive.
Absolutely. Thanks, Farley. So Jay, one question for you. So what's the biggest risk that you see now still in the supply chain realm?
Well, the risk, and one of the messages that we at Gray Analytics have been trying to get out, which is why we're partnering with NS2 and Sayari and other great companies, is that the risk to our intellectual property, right, to that American ingenuity, is not just through our cyber environments. As we've all started to secure and mature our cyber environments with CMMC, or just by virtue of awareness, the next frontier is to enter and steal the intellectual property through the supply chain. The FBI assesses that upwards of $600 billion a year in trade secrets are stolen just here in the United States. 60% of those cases have a direct nexus to China. 80% have some benefit to China, and Iran and Russia would love to catch up. So we really have to understand that just securing our cyber environments is sort of a half measure, and if we are going to take securing our intellectual property seriously, and it's not just in the defense industrial base, we have to maintain and secure the integrity of our supply chains. And a tool like ChainShield does exactly that. So,
Stephen, we'll give you the last word on this one. So what sort of issues would ChainShield help us to avert? You know, what are some things that examples of things that would not have happened if we had ChainShield online?
Yeah, so, you know, I'm going to put it in terms of what we've experienced with COVID-19 and, you know, what we see in the, you know, in the generic economy, you know. Certainly with COVID-19, as U.S. Attorney Town indicated early on, is, you know, that PPP and those kinds of things, that's all very important. You know, the pharmaceutical piece is very important. You know, early on in COVID-19, we were very concerned about whether or not we could sustain our warfighting force. Could we sustain our general population? Could we get the pharmaceuticals that were needed to just sustain the general population of the country, you know, with the other elements that exist within our population? You know, obviously those things resonate in a really powerful way. But the other thing that we're able to do that you would have thought we could have done, you know, within the last decade or two is to really understand, you know, where we're sourcing things, to really understand how we want to take advantage of foreign trade deals to procure end items from countries that allow us to adhere to United States code, and where women's suffrage is not an issue. Well, child labor is not an issue. So reality, Kyle, is, we feel like ChainShield, because it illuminates the supply chain from both procurement to order fulfillment with whatever item you put into the, into the solution, we're able to supply alternatives, and we're able to illuminate that supply chain, and we're able to look at threats more holistically as opposed to just whether or not there's a threat that exists in a chipset, or just looking at a DoD acquisition and trying to help a PM, make a risk decision as it relates to their hardware design, and their critical design review and their PDRs and those sort of things. So we're really excited about that, and a product like this, leveraging data from Ciari and other companies, is exactly what we need in our country. We need to know where we're sourcing things. We need to know what alternatives exist when we uncover issues, uncover threats, and those threats don't necessarily have to be nation state. There are other threats that exist out there, and we want to be able to illuminate that and be able to, promote alternatives.
I like the sounds of that. Yeah. So Stephen, Jay, and Farley, thank you all for joining me here in the studio for the conversation today. Really appreciate that. Even more than that, we appreciate your partnership with NS2 Labs and really look forward to some of the great things we're going to keep.
Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you, Kyle.
So thank you all for tuning into this session. If you want more information on any of these companies, on labs, on ChainShield itself, that information you can download it into your briefcase. And please do stay tuned. Our next session is going to be on how we're using technology to help get people back into the office more safely. Thank you very much.